every single detail of his downfall. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but let me tell you something. After 3 years in the freezer, this meal was absolutely Arctic, and it tasted better than anything I've ever experienced in my life. Have you ever fantasized about getting back at a boss who made your life hell? Well, I didn't just fantasize. I executed. And today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I turned my toxic boss's own weapons against him, and why it was the most satisfying thing I've ever done. My name is Marcus, and 3 years ago I was drowning, not literally, but professionally, suffocating under the weight of a boss who had turned what should have been my dream job into a daily nightmare. Richard Hawthorne was his name, and psychological warfare was his game. Every morning, I would sit in my car in the company parking lot for 10 minutes, taking deep breaths and mentally preparing myself for another day of verbal abuse, public humiliation, and systematic psychological manipulation. But here's what Richard didn't know about me. I wasn't just another broken employee counting down the days until I could escape. While he was busy playing his power games, I was playing a much longer, much smarter game. Every insult he hurled at me, every credit he stole, every lie he told, I was cataloging it all, building what would eventually become the most comprehensive and devastating case against a manager that our company had ever seen. You see, Richard thought he was dealing with just another weak, desperate employee who would eventually quit or break under pressure. What he was actually dealing with was someone who had decided that leaving wasn't enough. I wanted justice. I wanted consequences. And most importantly, I wanted to make absolutely sure that Richard Hawthorne would never be able to destroy another person's career the way he had tried to destroy mine. This is the story of how 3 years of patience, meticulous planning, and strategic thinking helped me turn the tables on the most toxic boss you could imagine. It's about the moment when the predator became the prey, and why sometimes the best revenge isn't moving on. It's making sure the person who wronged you faces real, lasting consequences for their actions. Let me paint you a detailed picture of Richard Hawthorne, a man who had turned middle management into a form of psychological torture. Richard was 48 years old, balding, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow that he thought made him look distinguished, but actually made him look like he'd given up on life. He wore the same 3 rotating suits, all slightly too small for his expanding waistline, and had this habit of clicking his pen during meetings, a sound that still makes my jaw clench to this day. But Richard's physical appearance was nothing compared to his personality. This was a man who had discovered that fear was an intoxicating form of power, and he was completely addicted to it. He would arrive at the office every morning like a predator surveying his territory, looking for signs of weakness he could exploit. I'll never forget my first real taste of Richard's management style. It was my 3rd week on the job. I had just graduated summa cum laude from business school, full of enthusiasm and naive optimism about corporate life. I had prepared a presentation on improving our client retention rates, complete with charts, data analysis, and actionable recommendations. I was proud of it. Hell, I was excited about it. Richard listened to my entire presentation in silence, his fingers steepled in front of his face like some discount version of a Bond villain. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Marcus, let me explain something to you about how things work in the real world. Your little college theories might have impressed your professors, but this is my department. And in my department, we don't need some fresh-faced kid telling us how to do our jobs." Then came the kicker. "I'm going to take your research and present it to the regional team next week. Don't worry, I'll make sure it's actually professional before I show it to people who matter." And he did exactly that. The following week, I watched through the conference room glass as Richard presented my work, my analysis, my recommendations, my 3 weeks of research to the regional directors. He even used my exact slides, just with his name in the corner instead of mine. When the regional team praised the innovative approach, Richard smiled and said, "Well, you know how I am about staying ahead of the curve." That was just the beginning. Over the following months, I watched Richard systematically destroy the confidence and careers of everyone around me. There was Jennifer from marketing, a brilliant woman with 15 years of experience who made the mistake of politely disagreeing with Richard during a strategy meeting. He responded by assigning her to manage our most difficult client alone. while simultaneously cutting her support staff and budget. When the client relationship inevitably soured, Richard called Jennifer into his office and screamed at her for 20 minutes about incompetence and failure to execute basic responsibilities. Jennifer, a woman who had never received anything less than stellar performance reviews, was in tears. She quit 2 weeks later. Then there was David from accounts, who had the audacity to point out an error in Richard's monthly report. Richard's response was to begin micromanaging David's every move, requiring hourly check-ins, demanding explanations for every email sent, and questioning every decision down to what supplies David ordered for his desk. David, a consummate professional who had been handling accounts for over a decade, started making actual mistakes because he was so stressed and second-guessing himself. Richard used these stress-induced errors to justify putting David on a performance improvement plan, which in corporate speak is basically a legal way of saying, "We're preparing to fire you." But the incident that really opened my eyes to Richard's true nature happened during our quarterly team meeting. Sarah from Analytics had prepared a presentation showing that our department's productivity had actually decreased over the past year. Despite Richard's constant claims about record-breaking performance, the data was irrefutable. Our output was down, our client satisfaction scores were dropping, and our employee retention was the worst in the company. Richard looked at Sarah's charts for exactly 30 seconds before standing up and saying, "Sarah, I want you to understand something. When I need your opinion about my department's performance, I'll ask for it. What you're showing here is clearly the result of faulty methodology and amateur analysis. I suggest you spend less time trying to make me look bad and more time figuring out how to do your actual job." The room went dead silent. Sarah, who was easily the most competent analyst in the building, turned bright red and spent the rest of the meeting staring at her laptop screen. After the meeting, I saw her crying in the bathroom. She transferred to another department within a month. This became Richard's pattern: isolate, humiliate, gaslight, and repeat. He had a particular talent for making his abuse seem justified to anyone who wasn't directly experiencing it. He would never yell or curse. Instead, he would use this calm, condescending tone that somehow felt worse than outright screaming. He would phrase his attacks as constructive feedback or performance concerns, always with that slight smile that let you know he was enjoying every second of your discomfort. The breaking point for me came exactly 8 months into my employment, during what was supposed to be my routine performance review. I had been working 70-hour weeks, had brought in 2 major new clients, and had consistently exceeded every metric and deadline. I walked into Richard's office expecting recognition, maybe even a discussion about advancement opportunities. Instead, Richard slid a manila folder across his desk, with all the ceremony of an executioner presenting a death warrant. Inside was a performance improvement plan. 3 pages of fabricated complaints and manufactured concerns that read like they were describing a completely different employee. Fails to demonstrate initiative and problem solving. I had literally reorganized our entire client onboarding process. Shows resistance to feedback and coaching. I had implemented every suggestion Richard had ever made, no matter how arbitrary or contradictory. Does not collaborate effectively with team members. I was the only person in the department who still regularly ate lunch with colleagues because I was the only one Richard hadn't completely demoralized. Demonstrates concerning attitude issues and lack of professional maturity. This one was my personal favorite, considering I had been nothing but professional even as I watched Richard systematically destroy the careers of my colleagues. As I read through this fictional account of my work performance, Richard leaned back in his chair with that self-satisfied expression I had grown to hate. "Marcus," he said, "I think you came into this job with some unrealistic expectations about how things work in the corporate world. This improvement plan is really an opportunity for you to recalibrate your attitude and show that you can be a team player." I looked up at him, and for the first time in 8 months, I didn't try to hide my thoughts. "Richard," I said, "this review doesn't reflect reality, and we both know it." His smile widened. "Well, Marcus, I guess that's exactly the kind of attitude I'm talking about. You can either sign this improvement plan and commit to making some changes, or we can discuss whether this position is really the right fit for you." That was the moment. Sitting in that chair, looking at Richard's smug face, holding a document that was essentially a corporate hit piece designed to justify my eventual termination. That was when I made the decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't going to break. And I wasn't going to let Richard destroy my career the way he had destroyed so many others. I was going to destroy his. That night, I went home to my studio apartment, poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad. At the top of the page, I wrote, Operation Downfall. Yes, I actually named it, because if you're going to destroy someone's career, you might as well do it with style. The planning phase began immediately, and I approached it with the same methodical precision I had once applied to my business school case studies. I created what I called the Richard File, a comprehensive documentation system that would have made the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit proud. This wasn't just a folder of complaints. This was going to be a complete psychological and professional profile of a toxic manager, complete with evidence, patterns, and undeniable proof of systematic workplace abuse. I went out and bought a small digital recorder, one of those tiny devices that looks like a USB drive. In our state, recording conversations is perfectly legal as long as one party consents, and I was always going to be that party. I practiced using it until I could activate it with one subtle hand movement, usually while pretending to check my watch or adjust my tie. But the recording device was just one tool in what became an increasingly sophisticated arsenal. I started carrying a small notebook everywhere, the kind that looks like a standard meeting notepad, but was actually my intelligence gathering journal. Every conversation with Richard was documented with exact quotes, timestamps, and witnesses present. Every email was screenshotted and saved to a personal cloud account. Every meeting where Richard stole credit, blamed someone else, or made inappropriate comments was carefully recorded. I even started staying late at the office, not to work overtime like everyone assumed, but to photograph documents. Richard had this habit of leaving sensitive papers on his desk when he left for the day. Performance reviews he was drafting, emails from upper management, reports that showed the real numbers versus what he was reporting to executives. I became an expert at quickly photographing documents with my phone, making sure the lighting was perfect and every word was legible. But documentation was just the foundation. The real work was psychological profiling. I spent months studying Richard's patterns, his triggers, his insecurities, and his ambitions. I learned that he arrived at work every day at exactly 7:47 a.m. and always stopped at the same coffee cart. I discovered that he was desperately trying to get promoted to regional director, and that he had been systematically embellishing our department's performance metrics to make himself look better to the executives. I found out that Richard had a standing golf game every Thursday with 2 other department heads. Information I gathered by simply listening to his phone conversations and observing his schedule. I learned that he was insecure about his education. He would get visibly uncomfortable whenever conversations turned to business school experiences or advanced degrees. This led me to what would become the crown jewel of my investigation. Richard had claimed on his resume, in company materials, and in casual conversations that he held an MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Business. It was part of his professional identity, something he brought up whenever he wanted to establish intellectual superiority over subordinates. I spent 3 weeks researching this claim, starting with LinkedIn, moving to Northwestern's alumni directories, and eventually calling the school's registrar office under the guise of verifying education for a potential client. What I discovered was beautiful in its simplicity. Richard Hawthorne had attended Northwestern for exactly 1 semester in 1998 before dropping out due to academic probation. Not only did he not have an MBA, he had actually failed out of the program. But here's where it gets really interesting. I discovered that Richard had been using this fake credential not just for bragging rights, but as a key qualification in his employment file. Our company had a policy that required MBA degrees for any management position above a certain level. Richard's fake MBA wasn't just a lie. It was the foundation of his entire career advancement. The psychological aspect of my planning was perhaps the most challenging part. I had to continue working under Richard's thumb while secretly building the case that would destroy him, and that required an Oscar-worthy performance. I became the perfect employee, agreeable, hardworking, never showing a hint of the resentment that was building inside me like pressure in a volcano. Every morning, I would look at myself in the bathroom mirror and practice my grateful subordinate expression. When Richard stole my ideas, I would smile and say, "I'm just glad I could contribute to the team's success." When he humiliated me in meetings, I would nod thoughtfully and say, "I really appreciate the feedback." When he assigned me impossible deadlines, I would respond with, "I'll do my best to make it work." But inside, I was cataloging everything. Every slight, every stolen idea, every manipulative comment was being filed away in my mental database. Richard thought he was breaking me down, but he was actually providing me with more ammunition. During this period, I also began carefully building relationships with my coworkers. Not to recruit them into some kind of workplace rebellion, but to ensure that when the time came, I would have credible witnesses who could corroborate the toxic environment Richard had created. I started eating lunch with different people, asking casual questions about their experiences with management, and most importantly, listening. What I discovered was that everyone had stories. Jennifer from marketing told me about the time Richard made her rewrite the same report 7 times, claiming each version was completely unacceptable without providing any specific feedback. David from accounts described how Richard would deliberately schedule important meetings during David's lunch hour, then criticize him for not being prepared when he arrived hungry and frazzled. Most importantly, I learned that several people had already gone to HR with complaints about Richard, but somehow these complaints had never resulted in any action. This told me that Richard had either found ways to deflect these individual complaints, or that HR was simply unwilling to act on isolated incidents. What I was building wasn't going to be an isolated incident. It was going to be an overwhelming pattern of evidence that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. My evenings became dedicated to research and preparation. I bought books on organizational psychology, employment law, and corporate governance. I studied landmark cases of workplace harassment and wrongful termination. I read everything I could find about documentation techniques and evidence preservation, but my favorite addition to the library was Sun Tzu's The Art of War. I know it sounds dramatic, but I was literally preparing for battle, and I wanted to learn from the master of strategic thinking. The principles I learned from that ancient text became the foundation of my entire approach. Know yourself and know your enemy. All warfare is based on deception, and most importantly, supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. I wasn't planning to confront Richard directly or engage in some kind of workplace showdown. I was planning to systematically document his behavior until I had built such an overwhelming case that his removal would be inevitable. I was going to use his own actions, his own words, and his own lies to destroy him. The emotional toll during this period was immense. There were nights I would lie awake until 3 a.m., replaying Richard's latest humiliation, feeling my jaw clench with anger and my hands shake with rage. I would fantasize about marching into his office and telling him exactly what I thought of him, about exposing him in front of the entire department, about watching his smug expression crumble as I revealed everything I knew. But every time I felt that urge for immediate satisfaction, I would remind myself of the bigger picture. This wasn't about momentary catharsis. This was about lasting justice. I would get up, go to my kitchen table, and review my growing collection of evidence. Each new piece of documentation was like adding another nail to Richard's professional coffin, and I was building something beautiful and terrible and absolutely unbreakable. Patience wasn't just a virtue in this case. It was a weapon, and I was learning to wield it with deadly precision. After 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days of meticulous preparation, the moment finally arrived. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and Richard had just delivered what would become the final performance of his career, though he didn't know it yet. The quarterly executive presentation had taken place the day before. I had watched through the conference room glass as Richard stood before the regional leadership team, presenting what he called unprecedented departmental growth and innovation. He used slides that I had created during my own time, research that Jennifer had compiled before she quit, and analysis that David had produced during his final weeks before his stress-induced breakdown. But the piece de resistance was Richard's presentation of our revolutionary client retention strategy, a comprehensive program that had increased client satisfaction by 34% and reduced churn by nearly half. Richard spoke passionately about his hands-on leadership approach and his innovative thinking that challenged conventional business practices. What the executives didn't know was that this entire strategy had been conceived, researched, and implemented by me and two colleagues who had since left the company. Richard's contribution had been limited to approving the budget and taking credit for the results. I knew this because I had recorded the original strategy sessions, documented every email exchange, and even had photographs of the original handwritten notes that outlined the program. As Richard finished his presentation to enthusiastic applause, I checked my watch. It was 3:17 p.m. The meeting I had scheduled with CEO Margaret Thompson and HR Director David Chen was set for 4 p.m. I had exactly 43 minutes to prepare for what would either be the most satisfying moment of my professional life or a career-ending disaster. I returned to my desk and opened the black leather portfolio that had become my most treasured possession over the past 3 years. Inside were 4 carefully organized sections, each tab labeled with clinical precision: audio documentation, performance discrepancies, policy violations, and fraudulent credentials. The first section contained transcripts of 47 recorded conversations, each one time-stamped and annotated. Richard berating Jennifer until she cried. Richard stealing David's quarterly analysis and presenting it as his own work. Richard making inappropriate comments about female employees' appearances during what should have been professional meetings. Richard lying to upper management about departmental turnover rates. But my personal favorite was a 15-minute recording from Richard's office where he bragged to another department head about his ability to manage through intimidation. In his own words, captured in crystal-clear digital audio, Richard explained his philosophy. These people need to understand that I hold their careers in my hands. A little fear keeps them motivated and prevents them from getting too comfortable. The moment they think they're indispensable is the moment they become useless to me. The second section was a masterpiece of data analysis that would have made my business school professors weep with pride. I had meticulously compared Richard's official reports to upper management with the actual departmental metrics, revealing a pattern of systematic deception that spanned 18 months. Richard had reported productivity increases of 23% when our actual output had decreased by 12%. He had claimed our client satisfaction scores were an all-time high when they were actually below industry average. Most damning of all, he had reported our employee retention rate as exceptional, while carefully omitting that we had lost 7 employees in 18 months. A turnover rate of nearly 60%. The third section documented 12 specific violations of company policy, ranging from misuse of confidential employee information to creating hostile work environments. Each violation was supported by email evidence, witness statements, and in several cases, audio recordings of Richard's own admissions. But the fourth section was my magnum opus, the complete dismantling of Richard's professional credentials. I had copies of his original employment application, his official company biography, and several internal documents where he had referenced his MBA from Northwestern. Alongside these were official letters from Northwestern University's registrar office, confirming that Richard Hawthorne had attended for 1 semester, achieved a GPA of 1.7, and been placed on academic probation before withdrawing from the program. But here's where it gets beautiful. I had also discovered that our company's employment contracts specifically required MBA degrees for management positions above level 3. Richard was a level 6 manager, meaning his employment was not just based on a lie, it was potentially fraudulent from a legal standpoint. At exactly 3:55 p.m., I walked to the executive conference room carrying my portfolio like a lawyer approaching the Supreme Court. Margaret Thompson was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table, reviewing some documents with her characteristic intensity. David Chen from HR sat to her left, a yellow legal pad and 2 pens arranged neatly in front of him. "Margaret, David," I said, settling into the chair across from them. "Thank you for making time for this meeting. What I need to share with you today concerns serious issues with departmental management that I believe pose significant legal and financial risks to the company." Margaret looked up from her documents, and I could see the slight skepticism in her expression. She had probably heard complaints about managers before. disgruntled employees with hurt feelings and minor grievances. What she wasn't expecting was the legal brief I was about to present. Before we begin, I continued, I want to be clear that this isn't about personal conflicts or workplace personality differences. What I've documented over the past 3 years represents systematic policy violations, fraudulent reporting, and what I believe constitutes a pattern of workplace harassment that could expose the company to significant liability. I opened my portfolio and placed the first audio transcript in front of them. This is a conversation between Richard Hawthorne and myself from 6 months ago, where he explained his management philosophy. I'd like you to read his exact words. Margaret picked up the transcript and began reading. I watched her expression change from polite attention to concern to outright alarm as she reached Richard's explanation of management through intimidation. David leaned over to read along, and I heard him mutter, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. "This conversation was recorded?" David asked. "All of them were. I have 47 separate recordings spanning 3 years, all obtained legally according to our state's one-party consent laws. Each recording is time-stamped, transcribed, and corroborated by additional evidence." I spent the next 90 minutes walking them through my documentation, watching their expressions grow increasingly serious with each revelation. The audio recordings were devastating. Hearing Richard's actual voice as he berated employees, made inappropriate comments, and bragged about his manipulative tactics was far more powerful than any written complaint could have been. But the performance discrepancy section was what really got their attention. Margaret spread the comparison charts across the table, studying the gap between Richard's reported metrics and our actual performance. "He's been falsifying departmental reports for over 18 months, I explained. "This isn't creative interpretation of data. This is systematic deception of company leadership. And it gets worse." I placed the Northwestern University letters in front of them. Richard's entire employment is based on fraudulent credentials. Not only does he not have an MBA from Northwestern, he failed out of the program after 1 semester. According to company policy, his current position requires an advanced degree he doesn't possess. David was furiously taking notes, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation methods. Margaret had gone completely silent, which in my experience with her meant she was in full CEO crisis management mode. "There's one more tipahing," I said, producing my final piece of evidence. "Richard has been using company resources to conduct unauthorized background investigations on employees he considers problematic. I have documentation showing that he accessed confidential HR files, financial records, and even social media information that was completely unrelated to job performance. This wasn't just a policy violation, it was potentially criminal." Margaret's expression shifted from anger to genuine concern about the company's legal exposure. "Marcus," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I need to ask you directly, why are you bringing this to us now? You've been documenting these issues for 3 years. Why not report them earlier?" I had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that was both honest and strategically sound. "Margaret, I wanted to make sure that when I came forward, I had undeniable evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Richard is skilled at manipulating situations to his advantage, and I knew that if I was going to make serious allegations, I needed serious proof. What you see here represents 3 years of careful documentation, specifically designed to protect the company from a toxic manager who has been systematically damaging both employee morale and departmental performance." Margaret nodded slowly, then looked at David. "What's our immediate exposure here?" David had been scribbling calculations on his legal pad. "If even half of this is accurate, we're looking at potential lawsuits from former employees, possible fraud charges, and definitely a Department of Labor investigation if any of this becomes public. The falsified reporting alone could trigger regulatory issues if we've submitted any of this data to external agencies." "And the timeline?" Margaret asked. "We need to act immediately," David replied. "Every day we don't address this increases our liability." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence spread across the table. Finally, she looked up at me. "Marcus, I want you to understand the seriousness of what you're alleging here. If this investigation confirms what you've documented, Richard's career isn't just over. He could face criminal charges." "I understand," I replied, "and I want you to know that I've consulted with an employment attorney to ensure that everything I've done is legal and ethical. I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking justice and protection for the employees who are still being subjected to this toxic environment. It was a lie, of course. I absolutely was seeking revenge, but I was seeking it through justice, which somehow made it feel more righteous. Margaret closed my portfolio and handed it back to me. David, I want you to begin a formal investigation immediately. Richard is suspended, effective immediately, pending the outcome. I want security to escort him from the building this afternoon, and I want his access to all systems revoked within the hour. She turned back to me. Marcus, you'll be reporting directly to me while we resolve this situation. I want you to know that the company takes these allegations very seriously, and we will ensure that there are no retaliatory actions taken against you. As I walked out of that conference room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Genuine satisfaction. Not the momentary pleasure of a small victory, but the deep, lasting satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served. I returned to my desk and began the most productive afternoon of work I'd had in months. Every few minutes, I would glance toward Richard's office, knowing that in less than 2 hours, he would walk through that door for the last time as an employee of our company. At exactly 5:43 p.m., I watched through my cubicle partition as 2 security guards appeared at Richard's office door. The conversation was brief and professional. Richard's face went from confusion to shock to genuine fear as he realized what was happening. As he was escorted past my desk, his laptop and phone already confiscated, Richard looked directly at me. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. The recognition that he had been outplayed by someone he had considered inferior. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I simply returned to my work, knowing that justice, patient, methodical, devastating justice, had finally been served. The aftermath of Richard's downfall was even more satisfying than I had imagined during those long nights of planning. Within 48 hours of his termination, the company launched a full internal investigation that uncovered even more disturbing behavior than what I had documented. Apparently, Richard had been running his toxic management style across multiple departments for years, and my evidence had given other employees the courage to come forward with their own stories. The legal consequences were swift and severe. Richard faced charges for fraudulent employment credentials and misuse of company resources. The fake MBA wasn't just a lie on his resume. It had been used to justify salary increases, promotions, and authority over employees who actually possessed the qualifications he claimed to have. The district attorney's office was very interested in what they called systematic employment fraud. But perhaps the most poetic justice came 6 months later, when I learned that Richard had been blacklisted in our industry. Word travels fast in professional circles, and when a manager gets terminated for fraud and workplace harassment, that information tends to follow them. The last I heard, Richard was working part-time at a retail store, a dramatic fall from his corporate kingdom. Our department, meanwhile, underwent a complete transformation under new leadership. Margaret promoted Jennifer, who had transferred to another department during Richard's reign of terror, to take over as our new manager. The culture change was immediate and profound. People started staying for lunch instead of eating alone at their desks. Colleagues began collaborating instead of competing. Most importantly, good work was finally being recognized and rewarded instead of stolen and exploited. As for me, I received the promotion that my work had always deserved, along with a significant salary increase and a formal commendation from the executive team for my courage in bringing serious issues to management's attention. But the real reward wasn't professional. It was the knowledge that I had successfully fought back against workplace abuse and won. Here's what those 3 years taught me. Revenge isn't about the momentary satisfaction of seeing someone get their comeuppance, though that was admittedly delicious. True revenge is about ensuring that toxic behavior has real, lasting consequences. It's about protecting future victims and creating accountability where none existed before. The patience, methodical planning, and strategic thinking that went into bringing down Richard weren't wasted effort. They were an investment in my own integrity and in the workplace culture I wanted to be part of. Sometimes the best response to workplace bullying isn't to turn the other cheek or quietly look for another job. Sometimes the best response is to methodically document every abuse build an unshakable case, and then watch justice unfold exactly as it should. Richard thought he was dealing with just another intimidated employee who would eventually quit or break under pressure. What he was actually dealing with was someone who understood that the most devastating revenge is the kind that's completely justified, entirely legal, and absolutely inevitable once set in motion. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a toxic boss who made your work life miserable? How did you handle it? Did you fight back, document the abuse, or did you choose to walk away and start fresh somewhere else? Drop your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious about how different people handle workplace toxicity. Maybe you tried confronting the situation head-on, or perhaps you found creative ways to protect yourself and your colleagues. Whatever your approach, I want to hear about it. And if you're currently dealing with a toxic boss, here's my advice. Start documenting everything. Not because you should necessarily plan a 3-year revenge campaign like I did, but because having detailed records protects you legally and gives you options if the situation escalates. Keep copies of emails, record conversations where legally permitted, and most importantly, don't suffer in silence. If you enjoyed this story of strategic workplace justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I've got plenty more stories about standing up to workplace bullies, dealing with corporate politics, and the sweet satisfaction that comes from outsmarting people who underestimate you. Next week, I'm going to tell you about the time a backstabbing colleague tried to sabotage my biggest presentation by deleting my files the night before, and how I turned her act of sabotage into the career-defining moment that got me promoted to senior management. Trust me, that story involves corporate espionage, a USB drive hidden in a coffee mug, and the most satisfying public humiliation you've ever heard of. Until then, remember, the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's getting smart, getting organized, and getting results. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it's absolutely worth the wait. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.